Hello, and welcome to Money Talks, a bonus podcast series from Slate Money, where we chat with brilliant and interesting people. I'm Emily Peck of Axios, and I'm also co-host of Slate Money. And today, we're talking about bras. Well, not really, but I thought that I would get your attention if I said bras. So I'm here with Lauren Sherman, a fashion correspondent at Peck. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And I'm here with Chantal Fernandez, a features writer for The Cut.
Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for having us.
They're the authors of this great new book called Selling Sexy, Victoria's Secret and the Unraveling of an American Icon. It's this great dive into not only the history of Victoria's Secret, but sort of feminist culture and its evolution over the past, 50 years, the golden age of retail, how we got fast fashion in the first place. So at the beginning, all I really knew about Victoria's Secret's sort of downfall was that Lex Wexner, its founder, which he isn't Victoria's Secret's founder even, so I was right off the bat wrong about that, but I knew that Lex Wexner maybe had ties to Jeffrey Epstein, but that's just not the story at all. This book is such a deep dive into so many things. And when we come back, I want to start at the beginning with the company's sort of humble start back in the 1970s, a story that involves a trip to a 1970s Times Square where a husband was buying vibrators for his wife, but for work. It was for work. So that's all coming up on Slate Money Talks. Apple Card is the perfect card for your holiday shopping. When you use Apple Card on your iPhone, you'll earn up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase, including products at Apple like a new iPhone 16 or Apple Watch Ultra. Apply now in the Wallet app on your iPhone. Subject to credit approval. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Terms and more at applecard.com. So until I read your book, I had no idea that Victoria's Secret was a company launched by this young couple, Roy and Gay Raymond, back in 1977. How did they get started?
Well, it's actually like a very modern story. Roy was a MBA at Stanford. So you hear about all these people like at business school, they get the startup idea, but he was in the late 60s there and really wanted to be an entrepreneur. The North Face, which was founded in the Bay Area, when that started out, he actually was like an MBA working on different business plans for them. Nothing he did came to fruition, but he got the startup bug very early, long before that was really a thing in America, especially for product companies. And when they were living in New York City, he was a marketing executive at a CPG company, and Gay was a physical therapist and a teacher, college instructor. She needed essentially vibrators to help her physical therapy patients and asked him to pick the story. And look, like Gay says, this is how it happened. We've learned many things about Victoria's Secret where the story becomes a reality. But Gay said that she asked him to sort of pick up a vibrator in the red light district in New York City one afternoon. And he realized, especially like Times Square and that time period was so vile. And he thought, oh, there's like nowhere for normal people who either just want to practice sexual wellness or want to, have a health reason to have a vibrator. There's nowhere to get one. So he thought this was sort of the era of the rise of the catalog because the suburbs were exploding and people needed to buy the things they used to buy at the five and dime. And he thought, oh, why don't we make a really nice, like standard, pretty sterile catalog that has sexual wellness stuff like sex toys, instructive videos, all this stuff that would help people be more comfortable with that category. And it was called Xandria, and it became a pretty big business. And from there, he was inspired to sort of take the same idea and apply it to underwear or lingerie, which was at that time either bought at very, very high-end exclusive shops that were really intimidating for most customers, or at Macy's, and it was totally sort of standardized, just the basics. So he thought, why don't I make it a comfortable place for men and women to be able to shop? And that's how Victoria's Secret was born.
Yeah, and this is a time when most retail, it was all these department stores. There wasn't this segmented, like you go to one store for your sneakers, or you go to one store for your jeans, and one store for your bras. But Victoria's Secret's really out at the front of that. And so they found this store, and it seems like it's doing okay, but it's also not doing very well. And that's when Lex Wexner enters the picture.
Yeah, the Raymonds, they didn't have experience running this kind of a business at this scale, and they were doing pretty well, but they were not able to manage the costs, especially Roy. I think he, invested a lot in each of the stores that he opened, a handful around the Bay Area, and it got to the point where they needed a bailout. And Wexner, who I think was at that time already really distinguished himself nationally as this, retail revolutionary with The Limited, which is a store that he opened in his mid-20s. Was kind of a rebellion against his parents, who had been shopkeepers, and he had seen an opportunity to open a store with a more limited type of apparel and cheaper, and his bet was completely right. Like his parents had sold sort of name brands that they bought from, middlemen in New York, and his business sort of undermined that business model and carried, clothing with The Limited on the label, and it was a huge hit. And especially by the early 80s, when he was thinking about acquiring different businesses, which he did, including Lane Bryant and others, and he came across Victoria's Secret and saw a huge opportunity with that business. Going back to what we were saying about this department store versus specialty retail model of you go to one place for one type of style or one type of category, he was really the specialty retail pioneer in the United States and totally disrupted department stores with his stores, which would later include, Express and Bath and Body Works and Abercrombie. And Victoria's Secret really later became kind of the crown jewel of his massive retail empire.
I want to talk about The Limited and a few things. Well, so like one innovation that he was on top of, or one edge, was like, narrow retail shop, that only one kind of thing. But the other is he is like this fast fashion pioneer. You note in the book that when he was getting started, like 70% of clothes sold in the US, or more than 70%, were made in the US, which is sort of like astonishing. I don't know what the number is now, but it's got to be like 2% or something.
I think it's under 2%.
That's and the way he sort of made that happen was I thought really interesting. Like he found this guy in New York who just had these connections. Were they in China or in Hong Kong?
Hong Kong.
Yeah. And so he developed this network, got the stuff made overseas. It's cheaper. And none of this is about fashion per se. I mean, Wexner had this thing that you guys write about where he wants to be a fast second. Yeah. Can you explain a little bit more about what that means and what it looks like today? Because I feel like everything today is a fast second.
Yeah, it's definitely, he was sort of proto Zara or proto H&M. And this idea of, at that time, you really couldn't get, like normal people didn't have access to trendy clothes. You were sort of given what you were given, and the way that the fashion world worked prior to the 60s and 70s was that like a department store would send one person to Europe for the shows. They would buy one Chanel suit and then they would make copies of it. And you would see Chanel for Bonwit Teller. And it was actually manufactured in the US by these companies. And that could take 3 years for something that was on a runway to sort of make it to the store. And what he did, I mean, the turnaround time for the manufacturing, first of all, he was unafraid of Asia. So he met this guy, Marty Trust, who you mentioned, who had worked for a company that produced sweaters in Hong Kong, realized that there was like a huge opportunity to produce the same quality with a higher margin, or close to the same quality with a higher margin abroad, and build a business around it. Wexner eventually acquired Marty Trust's manufacturing business, but Wexner realized very quickly that like he didn't care about being the leader in design or aesthetic or whatever. He cared about offering the customer what they wanted as quickly as humanly possible. And I think that's what the fast second thing is. It's about almost, we talk a lot about democratizing fashion now, but it really was about let's get them what they want as quickly as possible at the best value possible. And he was willing to go to Asia, which at the time, I mean, even now we talk about made in the USA a lot. It was really looked down upon to produce things in Asia in particular and China. And he decided that value would trump that way of thinking. And so the fact that he was able to kind of trend forecast, find a trend, identify it, and turn it around in, like, their turnaround times, I think, were sometimes 2 months. And even now, most fashion brands, the turnaround time for manufacturing something could be 6 months to a year. So he was just very quick on all of that. And if you look at companies like Inditex and H&M, you can see...
What does Inditex own?
Inditex owns Zara and also Massimo Dutti and a couple other businesses. If you look at the way they operate, a lot of it is derived from the way Wexner managed the Limited first, and then Victoria's Secret and Abercrombie and Fitch and all these other businesses that he incubated or developed and that became huge. So he was very interested in finding a pattern. He'd send all his employees overseas, let's shop for trends. Yellow was everywhere. Let's make everything yellow. And he could do that very quickly. Now, this is 20, 30 years before NAFTA. Once NAFTA happened, like, game over and everybody was doing this. But he really had the foresight, and he also managed the relationship with the US in terms of it wasn't okay for business leaders to do this kind of thing in the 70s and early 80s. And he was able to navigate that in a really careful way that by the time NAFTA did come around, he was so ahead of the game than so many of his rivals in terms of that speed to market in manufacturing.
Right. NAFTA and, I mean, China entering the WTO. This is all before all of that happened. It's really, I was pretty amazed. And I wanted to talk to you because I'm kind of old, I guess. And I grew up in the 80s. And I really hadn't thought about the Limited in a very long time. But just reading the book, I remember going to the mall, going to the Limited, and there was a specific item, the Fernandez sweater. Everyone had one. Everyone wanted one. And I was looking at pictures online just now. It's just like the boringest looking sweater. It's kind of like baggy, oversized sweater, V-neck. Is that cable knit or it's just like stripes? I don't even know. I'm not a fashion writer. It's just like a regular sweater.
I actually don't know what they would be called either. It's not cable knit.
No, it's not.
It's not cable knit. But
but it has a certain type of knit. Yeah. It's funny because in reading the book, so many of my friends have been like, is this the sweater? Because they're like, cannot believe that the sweater like made people lose their minds.
People would wear the sweater with like stirrup pants were really in style for a hot second back then. And you'd wear it with the stirrup pants. And then I was reading, and then you guys described this sweater was like a phenomenon. I don't know of an equivalent item of clothing in 2024 that I could say like, oh, everyone wants the X thing. Maybe, I don't know.
Maybe like
leggings
Samba
or something.
Sneakers or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
It was $30 back then, which I didn't do the math, but that's actually quite a lot of money. And it just struck me how cheap clothes are now. But that's sort of a side thing. But how big was the Fernandez sweater for them? Like, is that what took them sort of up to blockbuster status and kind of like got Wexner into that kind of like rarefied retail?
Absolutely. And the reporting from the time said that the Limited was selling the most clothing globally because it was selling the most clothing in the United States. It's hard to know if that's exactly true, but you know, at the time it felt like this is the most successful piece of fashion in the entire country. And it was a model that they were able to replicate with other things like Outback Red, which was because he had such a vast network of stores and malls across America. He could test that Fernandez sweater in certain markets. And then based on what colors people liked or what shapes or how the neck was shaped, could roll that out across the rest of the fleet and really take advantage of that. So that became their model of like test and learn was literal because they had this sourcing network through Marty Trust's company where they could really quickly ship things in from Hong Kong and build on what they had learned in this test and learn phase. That was the method that they had with Forenza and with these other sort of quote unquote capsule collections that sometimes shoppers thought was like a different brand because had a different name to kind of add to that excitement. So that was part of the strategy that they used really effectively. And it fits into this whole mantra of be a fast second. It's like he's only ever taking bets on things that he has some data to show that it's going to be successful. And fashion is so much about taking risks and trying to anticipate what customers want because you have to make the stuff ahead of time. That's where retailers get into a lot of trouble. And the people who've been able to mitigate some of that risk in some way, whether it's, Zara having this sort of last minute manufacturing that they built on, or, Shein today has taken that, that model even further. Those are the winners in this market.
The place in time where he would take risks was if he saw something was selling well, he would push his buyers to buy more of it. Like they had these famous Monday night meetings with Wexner. For much of the time he was in charge of the business, and he would say and where the sales executives, marketing executives would present like how things were going. And a lot of times he'd say, that's selling well. Why haven't you bought more of it? Why aren't you? And he would push them to like go really hard on stuff. And that's the Forenza sweater, which, by the way, I would say it's a ribbed knit is how you would describe it, which is simple. Knit. And the funny thing about that sweater is it also in some ways saved the Victoria's Secret catalog, which at one point was really struggling. Wexner wasn't convinced it could be a big business. And they put the Forenza sweater, a version of it, in the Victoria's Secret catalog with a different label, and it blew up in there too. It performed really well for them and helped them, move forward. So yeah, he was really into if something worked to go hard on it and not hold back. And so that was like the one place he used all the data. And once the data showed that he was on the right track, then he would be a little more confident, a little more bold.
You mentioned the Victoria's Secret catalog, and I honestly think I remember the pictures of the model with the Forenza sweater on, but no pants or something.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's talk about how the catalog kind of evolved over the years. You have some great photos in the book of these models and these really like kind of gauzy but untouched photos. Like you can see their pubic hair kind of through their underwear and everything. And it looks a little pornographic. And I mean, the company was mailing these catalogs out to like every households in America. How was it thinking about how it was selling lingerie to women and like what kind of women it was selling to? They were selling to.
Yeah, one of the interesting discoveries of researching this company is how much the catalog changed in different eras of the company. Like, the pubic hair era, which was really sort of the late 70s, early 80s when the Raymonds were running it. And, they were shooting in these mansions in San Francisco. And there's something sort of surreal and strange about the poses that the women are in. They're like on the phone in these frilly bedrooms. Yeah, like there's something kind of
just on the phone in their underpants all the time.
Yes, there's something sort of dangerous or lurking in the back, but it was also really inspired by kind of like those Twiggy images and other fashion photographers from the period who were more surrealist. And then when in the 80s, after Wexner acquired it, there was a period where it got sort of Basic Instinct style. The hair was more teased. There's more male models. They're in these kind of Palm Beach mansions. But yeah, and then there was an Anglophilia era, sort of British aristocratic kind of seeming women in these, mansions, but like very well appointed sort of beds and satin, sheets. And it was interesting because this is where the character of Victoria really came to life, and this idea of idealized femininity and kind of this indulgence. A lot of things that were subtle that I think really hit the zeitgeist, and it was part of what made that catalog famous because it was unlike anything else that people were receiving in their mailboxes, even when catalogs were really popular. And it had this editorial bent and kind of, yeah, it was like there's a lot happening there. There's stories of teen boys stealing them and all those kinds of things. So I think it was a really powerful mode of communication, not just of selling. It was like a really powerful marketing vehicle for this idea of what the Victoria's Secret woman looked like and what her life was like, which was a complete fantasy, even from the beginning.
Yeah, it was interesting before you said Lex Wexner is trying to figure out what the customers want and sell it to them. But it seems like with Victoria's Secret, it's like, let's figure out what men want to see women look like in catalogs when they're wearing their underwear and sell it to them? Or is that too much of an oversimplification?
I think part of it, but the interesting thing is for most of the company's trajectory, it was women who were running the business. So even Roy and Gay, pretty much every executive around them, there were a couple guys, but most of the senior executives, the head of marketing, the head of buying, the head of stores, they were all women. And the same thing at limited brands. So the CEO of Victoria's Secret was a woman for most of the time until he took over that job at the end as like interim CEO, and then appointed another woman, and mostly appointed women. And for the 30 years, it was really on the rise. There were women running that business. And then also the catalog was run by 3 women. So I would say there were conflicting things happening. So yes, there was this idea of, we're selling you something that's going to make you look good for your husband. But then there was also this idea of, we're going to sell you something that you have to wear lingerie anyway. Why don't you sell something that's going to make you feel sexy? And so I'd say the women in the business, look, like, were they thinking about the male gaze too? Of course. But I think they really believed they were empowering women to feel beautiful, whereas the men were more focused on, how are we going to make these women look attractive for other men? So it's interesting, like, every generation of this company would ask, what is sexy now? And if you asked the 5 top executives at the business at the time, they would all have a different answer. And so it's amazing that they were able to coalesce these things. But it was more complicated than just like, let's make women look hot so their husbands want to have sex with them.
I think that even the idea, the phrase, the male gaze, was not something that people were thinking about at that time. They were thinking about selling and what's successful. And this is what was functioning, across fashion marketing. This was before the idea that you would want to have body diversity in advertising. So the idea was, you wanted to aspire to be thin or beautiful like the women in these advertisings. And no one really questioned that. And that worked. And I think you can look back at it now with today's eyes and see something different. But the shift that happened in the 1990s with the arrival of the angels was really significant in terms of the imagery. That's when you in the catalog have the models leaning against a Ferrari wearing, angel's wings and lingerie. So there's, things got more explicit at that time, but that also coincided with a time of huge sales growth for the company for a bunch of different reasons, not just the advertising. But I think they felt like this strategy was working. And by all accounts, it was.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about the Angels. The first Victoria's Secret fashion show aired in 2001, just a couple of months after 9/11, which I was kind of jolted by. And that seems like really launched, I think, the era that most people would be familiar with Victoria's Secret, the Victoria's Secret Angels, Giselle Bundchen with the wings. And in the book, you sort of lay out how their look really like lines up with sort of the crass style of the early aughts, and like, thong underwear peeking out of low-rise jeans, very skinny women. It's all happening for Victoria's Secret in that moment. And that went on for a while, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the Angels aesthetic that started, really in the mid-90s, but bloomed in the early 2000s is really what they kept with until, the more recent turnaround years, like after 2020, basically. Mm-hmm. But they were responding to what was happening in the culture. It was a really sexy time, for example, in high fashion. If you think about Tom Ford at Gucci, and it was a provocative time, MTV, Girls Gone Wild, and they were sort of tame by comparison to a lot of those things, but picking up on those same ideas about sort of sexual liberation through exhibitionism and using the same sort of colors that were happening in blockbuster films and music. And I think part of the reason why people remember that period so well is because they so effectively communicated to just mainstream America through Super Bowl commercials, television commercials, commercials, the fashion shows, ads, the stores, the catalogs. Like it was all aligning to create this idea of this American beauty standard through these models.
Okay, so let's take a break here. When we come back, we've talked about the rise of Victoria's Secret, and now I want to talk about the fall. Apple Card is the perfect card for your holiday shopping. When you use Apple Card on your iPhone, you'll earn up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase, including products at Apple like a new iPhone 16 or Apple Watch Ultra. Apply now in the Wallet app on your iPhone. Subject to credit approval. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Terms and more at applecard.com. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. This episode is brought to you by Public.com. Did you know you can lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at Public.com? The Federal Reserve recently announced a big rate cut, and there could be more rate cuts this year and in 2025 as well. That's good news if you're looking to buy a home, but it might not be so good for the interest you earn on your cash. So, if you want to lock in a 6% or higher yield with a diversified portfolio of high yield and investment grade bonds, check out Public.com. It only takes a couple of minutes to sign up, and once you lock in your yield, you can earn regular interest payments even as rates decline. Lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at public.com/Slate Money. But remember, your yield is not locked in until you invest. Brought to you by Public Investing, member FINRA and SIPC. As of September 26, 2024, the average annualized yield to worst across the bond account is greater than 6%. Yield to worst is not guaranteed. Not an investment recommendation. All investing involves risk. Visit public.com/disclosures/bond-account for more info.
What's 2FA security on Kraken? Let's say I'm captaining my soccer team, and we're up by a goal against, I don't know, Soda Springs FC. Do we relax? No way. Time to create an extra line of defense and protect that lead. That's like 2FA on Kraken, a surefire way to keep what you already have, safe and sound. Go to kraken.com and see what crypto can be. Not investment advice. Crypto trading involves risk of loss. Cryptocurrency services are provided to U.S. and U.S. territory customers by Payward Interactive Inc., PWI DBA Kraken. View PWI's disclosures at kraken.com/legal/disclosures.
Mothers know all about life's tricky transitions. Thankfully, Ollie helps you prioritize wellness through every age, life stage, or magnificent mood change. Need a multitasking multivitamin that keeps up with you? How about an essential prenatal for you and baby? Ollie's got you through it all. Life's tricky. Your wellness routine shouldn't be. Get what you need at ollie.com.
I think we need to talk about Ed Razic. He is a main character in this book, that is to be sure. The New York Times published an expose on him sort of right around the Me Too era when there was one of these stories coming out every other week. He's why I think I asked that question earlier about here are men deciding what women want. And he has this one quote, I think it was either in your book and the New York Times piece or both. We sell hope, not help. So the company, wasn't selling larger size bras, wouldn't feature plus size models. It seems like all of that was fine. And Ed Razic's behavior was fine. And it was some objectionable behavior. There was groping, there was pressuring models to be romantically involved with him and then getting rid of them or not hiring them back if they wouldn't. It seems like that was all overlooked and fine until around the 20-teens, 2012, 2013, 2014, when the culture started shifting away from the Ed Razics of the world, way before Me Too. And that's when things sort of start to turn for Victoria's Secret. Do I have that kind of right?
Victoria's Secret was still growing. It had its peak years in 2015, 2016. But we feel like some of the problems that were so painfully clear, like around 2018, 2019, really started to develop in the earlier 2010s. And a lot of it had not to do even with like corporate culture, or it was connected to corporate culture, but it was about how to manage such a big business and shifting trends, things like the rise of the bralette, which is like a softer wireless bra that was starting to become super trendy, and the rise of competitor brands like Aerie that were bringing, they were theoretically not airbrushing their models and they had more body diversity. They were hitting on that cultural change that was about to become really apparent that Victoria's Secret didn't want to participate in. And I think Ed Razic, as the architect of the Angels and having been so successful with that for so many years, he and Wexner were hesitant to abandon anything that the brand was known for at that point. And I think that was part of the reason why they failed to evolve years after, all their competitors, not direct competitors, but years after the rest of the fashion industry had said, okay, we need to work with influencers who have different body types and hire different types of models and rethink how we communicate with people. The company was so big and so successful. I think they were blinded by that success. But I think Ed's scrutiny, especially like, for example, in that article, came at a moment when the company was already struggling. And I think when the company was really successful, these things were difficult to highlight because how can you see, it's working, everything's working, and the company's still growing. So what could culturally really be that wrong? That's a pretty standard reaction in a lot of businesses, right? It's like only when Harvey Weinstein's films are not doing so well that people are, brave enough, understandably, to come out and talk about their experiences with him. We've seen that in a lot of different sectors.
Yeah. Throughout the book, you have these like very powerful women at the top of Victoria's Secret, but just below Wexner and Razic. And this is when you start to see why that's problematic, I think, because these women are saying like, let's hire a transgender model. Let's bring in someone plus size. Let's get an influencer. Like they wanted to make those changes. But then you have these two older men, Wexner, who used to be, quite innovative, trend-setting kind of person, but just, I don't know if like this is the future we're all headed to as we age, but, just resistant to change once they found what works for them,
Yeah, I think when you have a lot of success and you keep having success, and Wexner was certainly someone who, the whole adage of you don't want to become the thing you're trying to disrupt. I think he really, for the first 40 years of business, stood by that and would push and push and push and push and push to make sure that they were doing it right. But I think when you are at the top of your game and you keep seeing performance going well, of course he thought he was doing something right. And if you talk to executives that were there in the late 2000s, there are stories of him still pushing back and still trying to move forward. And then you sort of see this shift where he just stops listening to people and also starts surrounding himself with people who don't challenge him.
Yeah.
And so by the mid 2010s, when this all came to a head, there was no one there to tell him no. And so it became harder. And I think it just happens with people who are very powerful. Like the more success they have, the less they question themselves. And he was just a sort of extreme example of that. And it was just, they were in a bubble. I remember a person who works in the fashion industry reaching out to me around 2015 around the show and saying to me, why is everybody still okay with this? And I thought, you know what? She's right. Like, why is everybody engaging with this? It feels so, more than anything, it just feels dated. It just doesn't feel like it's with the times. And I see this with companies. Chantal and I both cover the fashion industry. We write about a lot of different brands, a lot of different price points. But you see this when companies are doing really well, they start to get, in many cases, just get boring. But in the case of Victoria's Secret, it was really about becoming dated. And yeah, I think you could take it out of this industry and apply it to any industry, but it's just this matter of he had unprecedented success far beyond retail and fashion. If you look at what he achieved, it's really remarkable. And so no one was pushing back on him. So he thought, well, I must be right about all this stuff. And The reality was he needed to put that entrepreneurial hat on once again. And I think he just was too far in it to be able to do so.
You know, what we found was so fascinating about Victoria's Secret is not that it had these struggles that it's had since the mid 2010s, but that it didn't have this kind of downfall before, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, which was so damaging for so many of its mall peers. Victoria's Secret came out of that crisis even stronger than it was before. They just managed it so well. And, you know, they came out of that with this hit product, which was the bombshell bra that gives you 2 extra cup sizes. So like their formula was working really well. Even after the mall was starting to lose traffic, they seemed like the outlier, like Sephora and the Apple Store that could survive anything. So it's remarkable that they lasted so long and pivoted successfully so many times. But then, yeah, it's difficult, I think, especially after Sharon Jester Turney was the CEO of the company for over a decade. She left at the beginning of 2016, and Wexner stepped into leading the company on a more day-to-day basis for the first time in decades. And a lot of the choices that he made that first year were really bewildering to the executives that remained at the top of the company because they felt like he was violating that test and learn strategy that he had taught them so effectively. But yeah, things were really going off the rails starting then.
And then I guess we should mention around then, the information resurfaced that his close financial advisor, who he had given power of attorney to, was Jeffrey Epstein. And that really swirled up for him and became a story that kind of engulfed him. Did it lead him to resign, or do I have that just tangled in my head?
It was a factor. And this information came out with more clarity after Epstein was arrested in the summer of 2019. And to clarify, Wexner says that his relationship with Epstein ended, I believe it was in 2007, around the time that he was charged for the first time in Florida for, I think it was child prostitution. So their relationship had ended, you know, for some time. And Wexner maintains that he never knew about Epstein's crimes. But I think there was so much interest in that story. It was so disturbing, these questions around who knew what when, that it put a lot of attention on Wexner because he was like the first and clearest client that Epstein had ever had in this sort of upper echelon world. And it couldn't have come at a worse time for Victoria's Secret and for Wexner personally, given all the other challenges in the business and these cultural questions around, is this show good for society and all of those things. So yes, and I think it was a factor that led him to step down. And in recent years, he's really sort of faded from public view. Not that he was the most public person in the world, but he would give speeches sometime. He was so involved in Columbus civic life, and he's really receded, I think, as a result.
Yeah, they would have people over to their house. House is probably not the right word. Their estate. They'd have like a big day out where like tons of employees would come, but also just like people in the community because he's so involved. He owns so much of Ohio in terms of land and development, but also he's really involved in the performing arts and the medical system, like everything. There's a Wexner branded building around every corner. So the fact that he had to like pull out of that part, especially as he's over 80 in retirement age, that's the kind of stuff that if you're still active, you want to be really involved in. And the people who run those organizations have also had to distance themselves from him, which I think they feel a bit of sadness and shame about. So that was an interesting part that we didn't get too deep into in the book, but could probably be a book in and of itself.
Our producer, Cheyna, just shared this amazing song, Lex Wexner Will Live On in Infamy. And the chorus is, I know Victoria's Secret. She was made up by a dude. There you go.
Yes. And the TikTok of that song like has him, I think, photoshopped with like a Victoria's Secret hair on his head. It's
hilarious.
It's quite a lot.
Where is Victoria's Secret at right now?
It's at a super fascinating moment right now, I think. They just brought back their fashion show for the first time in 6 years. The reaction was mixed online. They brought back a lot of the original Angels, but they're definitely at sort of a turning point. Like, is this turnaround finally going to come together? Is it going to work? They've had a revolving door of, executives and leaderships and strategies really throwing stuff against the wall. They got rid of the Angels. They had this thing called the Angel Collective, so many different campaigns and things that they've tried. And they just hired a new CEO, Hillary Super, who came from Savage X Fenty, Rihanna's brand, which is one of the most effective challengers to Victoria's Secret, at least culturally, if not revenue wise. And it will be interesting to see if under this new leadership, they can find a way to sort of seduce customers once again. And I think there's an opportunity to do it. It's very tricky. They still have probably too many stores. It's probably a business that needs to shrink to grow or just shrink to be healthy. But I think Lauren and I, in looking at it, especially over the last month, it's a really fascinating kind of point of what's going to happen next with this brand, because a lot of time has passed since, for example, Wexner and Razic left, and the future is still unclear.
I just, full disclosure, I am wearing a Victoria's Secret bra right now.
Wow,
Yes.
interesting.
Yes.
Which one? Tell us.
How old is it?
Well, I have a teenage daughter, and we went to the mall, and she was like, let's go in there. And I was like, what? Okay.
Interesting.
And it was actually a great experience. Like, I was shocked. Their dressing rooms have these touch screens in them. So if you pick the wrong size, you can just bing, bang, boom. And a woman comes and gives you a different size to try on. You can order online from the screen. I just thought it was really good customer service. And I asked my daughter, I was like, do your friends like Victoria's Secret also? And she was like, yeah, we really like it. And where else is there in the mall to get a bra? Nowhere.
Still.
No.
And that is one of the reasons they've been so successful, is that it's not easy to make a bra. And they had such a sophisticated network of stores that they were able to really hold on to that market share. And even now they still have a tremendous amount. Yeah, it's interesting. To me, I question if there's a there to Victoria's Secret anymore. It's not like the Gap or even Abercrombie, where there's a lot of nostalgia or goodwill towards this brand. I think like there is a little bit of nostalgia, and people have nostalgia for that early 2000s era generally. So Victoria's Secret sort of fits into that. But I think because of the way Wexner operated, it was an emotional brand, because buying a bra is an emotional experience, but the brand itself wasn't emotional in the way that like a Gap or an Abercrombie was. And that was because Mike Jeffries and Mickey Drexler cared much more about kind of digging into the consumer and making them feel something, where I don't think Wexner operated that way. And he was kind of like, you have to do this. This is your only option. And it was a little more of an arrogance and less emotionally driven. That said, I think because it wasn't as emotionally driven, it had a much longer shelf life, because no one's going to say they're sick of Victoria's Secret. They need a bra. So they're going to just keep buying bras. But right now, I think the challenge is people have a lot more options bra wise, maybe not at the mall, but Skims and online Aerie. There's all these tiny little brands that I'm served up on Instagram stories every day. And you can easily access that stuff online. So you don't have to shop in the store if you don't want to. And I think like they haven't figured out how to be a brand in this era. And it's really hard. Most brands haven't figured it, don't understand it. And so they've just got this tremendous challenge ahead of them. They're a giant business that doesn't actually make that much profit because they sell everything so deeply discounted. So the consumer's used to buying it on sale. Then they have all this like weird, people are conflicted because of the act of buying a bra is so emotional, et cetera. And then on top of it, there isn't a ton of goodwill towards the brand in the way you would think of goodwill in terms of Gap or some of these other brands of that era. So it's just a really big challenge. And I hope they can do something interesting with it. But the one thing that is always good to remember in retail is that, like, even if they fail, it's going to be around for 15, 20 more years. These brands don't go away. They just like slowly. They're still JCPenney. Like it just doesn't, they slowly die off. And especially because when you have such a sophisticated retail network, these leases are forever. And so you just keep shipping goods, you sell it for whatever, you just basically give it away. And it's a cycle. So they could turn it around for sure, but it's going to be really hard. And the more likely outcome is that it will slowly deteriorate to the point of nothingness 30 years from now or what have you.
Yeesh. So
Yeah,
I wanted to ask you one last question. I mean, we have managed to get through an entire podcast and not talk about the election, which as we're taping was very recent. But I couldn't help thinking about the return of the Victoria's Secret fashion show and the return of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump sort of has a Victoria's Secret sensibility. A lot of the women that surround him kind of remind me of the Victoria's Secret early 2000s sensibility. I mean, they're wearing suits and clothes, but like the same kind of like long wavy hair. So I was just thinking, like, is his comeback good for the Victoria's Secret brand in some way? Is there like some kind of post Me Too backlash era that's upon us that would make the brand more relevant again? Or am I just spinning an idea?
I'm sure Lauren has slightly different views than I do on this, but I think we had even started to see that in the Biden era, during the first Trump administration where like resistance culture became pop culture. I think Victoria's Secret really suffered as a result of that, because in an attempt to update with the times and be quote unquote more woke, it all felt disingenuous and they were in a lose-lose situation. And there was a moment where all consumer brands were getting more political. And I think Victoria's Secret really struggled in that moment, obviously, as we saw. And I think in recent years, brands have pivoted. We've already seen sort of that diversity trend start to recede in fashion advertising and fashion brands, and identity politics becoming less of a thing to use to market to shoppers. And I think Trump's win only reinforces those ideas that culture has shifted and what signifies exclusivity or wanting to belong or coolness has shifted. And I think in a way that will be beneficial to Victoria's Secret, because they could never win in that sort of super feminist, again, like resistance culture era, because it was so inauthentic to what they had been most recently in customers' memories. So it could be helpful to them that culture is shifting.
Yeah, I generally agree with Chantal, but I truly, truly believe that consumers don't vote with their dollars. So anytime you are trying to align with some sort of movement outside of what you're selling, I don't think it ever works. The Levi's saying they're anti-gun, fine. That's not going to make someone buy Levi's or not buy Levi's. It just doesn't matter. What matters is that you feel like you're getting a value and you like the thing that you're going to buy. And yes, I think that it helps that people aren't pushing back against things like that fashion show that just took place, which was, they sort of checked a lot of boxes in terms of diversity and inclusion. In some ways, it actually was pretty diverse, like age diversity, things like that. In other ways, it was just like pretty boring and not exciting. And so I think generally, I don't think it's great for them or not great for them. I think the bigger thing is that they need to figure out a product that people really, really want. And look, you had an amazing time, an amazing experience in that store. A lot of people just aren't even compelled to go into the store.
Yeah,
they don't even think about it. Yeah, or they just don't even know that all that stuff's available. They haven't done a good job at communicating what's available and the things that the consumer cares about now, which is like a really good fit, a lot of variety.
Good price, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So my whole thing is like, sure, it's probably a little beneficial for them that there's like a throwback to that era and there has been this like anti-woke thing going on. But on the other hand, I don't think either way it really affects it, especially if you're selling something good. So we'll see. It is interesting that it's all sort of happening. And someone did text me that night and said, this is essentially saying that Donald Trump is going to be elected the night of the show. And that's exactly what happened. So yes, it's definitely related, but I don't know if it will actually benefit them from a financial perspective.
So that's it for our show today. Thank you both for coming on.
It's really fun.
Thank you for having us, Emily. This is really fun.
Thanks to Slate senior producer Cheyna Roth and to Jessamine, Molli, and Seaplane Armada for producing. Ben Richmond is Senior Director of Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is Vice President of Audio for Slate. I'll be back in your feed on Saturday, along with Anna Szymanski and Elizabeth Spires for a regular episode of Slate Money. And until then, thanks for listening.